Okay, so here's a quick lesson on relative clauses. What does relative mean? You know, it's a person who's connected with another or others by blood or marriage. But on a more basic level, it's some relation or connection to something else, and that's really what relative clauses help us to do. The word clause, it is in his last name, but it's not in this context. A subject and a predicate and forming a part of a sentence or constituting a whole simple sentence. That's what a clause is. And we've already talked about clauses a little bit this semester. Remember the game When the Big Wind Blows? So if you can remember that game, When the Big Wind Blows was a relative clause. When creates a relative clause. To make it into a complete sentence, you would say, when the big wind blows, everyone who's wearing glasses stand up. So you have a real life example of a relative clause. The key words for relative clauses include who, whom, whose, that, which, when, where, and why. Can you recognize a relative clause when you see one? It has to include one of those key words, and it has to be a clause. So example number 1, Violet eats the egg, not a relative clause. However, you can turn it into a relative clause if you write, when Violet eats the egg, comma, she says, yummy. You also have defining and non-defining relative clauses. Here's an example of a non-defining relative clause. Violet Halford, who is my daughter, loves to eat eggs for breakfast. So we practiced writing a relative clause, and it had to be about an elephant who hated cold weather, and when the weather got cold, he did something strange. Those sentences are in your textbooks. The difference between a defining and a non-defining relative clause, sometimes these are also called essential and non-essential clauses. I prefer defining and non-defining because, in my thinking, a clause can still be essential to the meaning of the overall sentence or to the paragraph, but it might not define the main noun in the main clause. So I prefer defining and non-defining. Defining or essential clauses do not require a comma, whereas non-defining or non-essential clauses do require a comma. So that's a basic difference in terms of punctuation between those two. However, it does get a little bit more complicated than that. Here's an example of defining. The students who I am teaching are learning grammar. Who I am teaching is the relative clause, and in my thinking, it defines students in an important way. It's an essential component to making sense of the sentence. However, let's look at an example of non-defining. The donair, which Peter Gamalukas invented in the 1970s, is a popular food in Atlantic Canada. So in contrast to the previous sentence, this sentence would still work without the relative clause, which Peter Gamalukas invented in the 1970s. Which Peter Gamalukas invented in the 1970s is historical information, but the sentence is really about the popularity of the donair. So in my thinking, the relative clause in this example is non-defining. A quick lesson about whom and who, when to use who and when to use whom. So you use who for the subject and whom for the object. Here's a base sentence. The class ate their teacher. Oh no. And class equals the subject, teacher equals the object. So if you're talking about the class, you would use who. The class who ate their teacher was infamous. We talked about this in class a little bit. In my thinking, whom sounds a little bit old-fashioned. There are still times when it is necessary to use it, but I would be cautious about using whom too much. Whose indicates possession. Here's an example. The teacher whose class ate him, never taught again. One quick lesson on that or which. If the clause is not necessary, use which. If the clause is necessary, use that. And we already have an example of this. And instead of necessary, I should have put defining and non-defining. The donair, which Peter Gamalukas invented in the 1970s, is a popular food in Atlantic Canada. The donair that I ate yesterday is giving me indigestion today. So there's a quick little example of the differences between that or which. We concluded the class by talking about where, when, why, and what. Use where for places, areas, and situations. You use when for time, and you use why for reasons. That's just a quick recap of relative clauses, and as always, if you have any questions, you can email me or come visit me in the office that I share.